Okay, hello everybody for this talk about Nifty details of Maven configuration plugin on a way to configure different plugins. Just a few words about me. My name is Karl Heinz Marbaise. I'm working as a freelancer and things like that. I'm working about 13 years in the meantime on the Apache Maven project. At the moment I'm the Apache Maven PMC chairman of the project. So I can tell you about a bit of the details of the project, and we can continue with the configuration for different plugins, how they configured, and what you can do in different situations to configure different plugins. And the details are very important because many people are struggling with the different configurations, how a plugin can be configured, or what you can do and prevent inheritance of configurations or something like that. Or if you want to run a goal, for example, from a plugin on the plain command line. And that is sometimes a little bit unpleasant or inconvenient to do that, and there are different ways to make that more convenient for you as a user. A short overview of my agenda here. We are talking a little bit about the configuration on the command line. That means we are focusing first on the command line, on goal executions. I do some examples here. Also, we do a little bit more detailed configuration in the lifecycle, how you can use the different lifecycle configurations. And as I mentioned before, the configuration inheritance, which you can prevent in some ways, or where you can override some particular configuration elements in particular situations. That's the most important part. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask in between if you have detailed questions, or if we are running out of time, I'm available up to tomorrow as well, so if you have more detailed questions, just ask me. I will do the whole thing as a real presentation. I do not do right here code on the command line plane. So I show you first a simple project which I have created here. I hope you can read that. If it's fine, if someone can't reading that, please raise your hand so I can change the view here. I have a more or less simple multi-module build here configured. There is two modules, very simple. They're just not focusing on the code, just on executing some tests and things like that. But first we start with some setup to get some information about the dependencies which we would like to update, get information how we can update. There is a command line tool, or more precisely, there is a plugin, the so-called versions Maven plugin, which can give you some information about what kind of dependency updates are available and things like that. So we would take a look here. Just cleaning up things to make it more convenient here to read the whole project structure. You see at the top left here, you see the POM XML of the root of the configuration of this project, because it has two modules, which are first versions mod 1 and versions mod 2, and these two have as well a POM. Of course, we have a POM file here, which contains some configuration, and there we will look into details how to override and use that configuration. So the first thing we can do is to give some information about the dependencies which are existing in general about that, and that can be done by using the goal display dependency updates. If we do so, we get a lot of information here. And that's a little bit overwhelming because there are many informations at the moment we are not interested at the moment. We are using a particular setup, I will show later in the POM, but you see there is, for every module here, there is a printout of the versions Maven plugin which shows the information, the same information. So it's a little bit inconvenient to use that and to look at that. So we would like to improve that situation to make that more convenient and get more precise information here. So let us first look how it looks like in the POM file here. Just a second. So we have an appropriate configuration here. I will go to the root POM here, and we have some dependencies here. We have a dependency management, and we have a separate dependencies. To be honest, I use that supplemental dependencies here with intention, because it's not a very good idea to do that, supplemental dependencies in a parent, but you can do that. Most of the time you should define your dependencies in your dependency management. Makes your handling easier to override things and get more convenient handling. So the point here is, as you've seen already on the command line, you get many informations about updates of the JUnit Jupyter, for example, here. A lot of output here. You see there is a JUnit Jupyter update here, things like that, and also the platform and things like that. But at the moment, I have only defined the BOM file here in these single dependencies, and I think it would be more convenient to see only that update and not the updates which are given by the BOM file itself. So I'm more interested to say, I would like to know precisely the information about the JUnit BOM file here, which should be updated, not the dependency it's defining itself here. That makes more sense. The same here for the SJ BOM. I have done that the same way. So the question is, can we focus on these steps here to make that more convenient for us as a user? So the first thing we can do here is simply to prevent automatically recursing into these supplemental modules. That is very easy with Maven here. You can do that by dash uppercase N, non-recursive here at that case. That means it will only check the parent here. So we have not all the plugin, the supplemental modules visited here. We are only visiting the parent here, which is more important here. So I think that it's more than sufficient here. So the next step is we would like to reduce the number of information we get here to process only the information which are in the dependency management given here. That can be done by using some supplemental command line options here. That is very easy. You can look them up into the documentation. I will do that very fast here, Maven versions plugin. And then you can look up them into the documentation, display dependency updates. I hope you can read that. So there are a lot of options here which you can give here. There is one most important one. There are 3 different styles of them to say, okay, process dependencies, process dependency management, and process dependency management transitive on things like that. And the most important here is exactly this one here, because we want to see only the dependency management entry, but not to process the dependencies which are given by that BOM file here. So we can just simply do that and give that on the command line as well as a parameter here. That can be done simply by that. If I use the true, which is the default value here, it will not change anything. Just to make it clear. So now I change the default value and give the false here. And that means we are dropping down the information the number of information. Now you're seeing more focus, that we are seeing only the information about the BOM entry itself. So we have only 2 entries, JUnit BOM, which is correct exactly because we have 1 entry. And we have another entry here, the SJ BOM here as well. So you see exactly the information in this case which are interested in. But we have supplemental information which we might not interested at the moment. We have supplemental dependencies here, defined, separated into the BOM, as you've seen before. And we also get information about the plugin management, or more precisely, the dependencies of the given and defined plugins in my configuration here. So I want to focus only on this part here at the first place, to focus on these dependency management part here. I would like to focus that and just ignore the rest for the first step here. I can do that by using supplemental configuration options here. I can look up them into the documentation, but it becomes a little bit unhandy and things like that. So we can do that in a different way. So I can put some supplemental here and just remove that and turn them off because they are on by default. So you see the dependency itself has now omitted here in that output. So I can continue that and just remove the information about the plugin configuration here as well. So you can continue that and give more and more options. So far, more or less fine, but unfortunately a little bit inconvenient here at that case. Because if you think about that, every time you want to type that and give that report out there, you have to remember all these exact parameters and the values and exactly how they are written. And that is a bit cumbersome and error-prone in the end. But what happened there is that many people are starting to writing some scripts or shell scripts or whatever, but there is a convenient way to do that already in Maven itself. There is a very simple way to do that. So if you take a look on a detailed output here, which you're getting through the execution of the command line here, you can see that there is always an output in the parentheses here. That means default CLI. That means that this plugin is automatically executed with a default set of configuration. And by default, there is no definition of that. That means the default configuration means the defaults of the plugin, in other words, here. And these defaults can be overwritten and used for our purposes here and make our life easier here in that case. So we can do that and simply go into that part here, and I can define this plugin in a way I need to. For example, I want to write that configuration here. For example, versions maven plugin. I hope so that I correctly type that. The version I don't define because I already defined the version here in the plugin management part. So now I need to do a configuration part and do some executions here. I will later come more details. Just to be honest, I have already prepared that because I wanted to copy that because I want to prevent typing errors from my side here. So I have prepared that. I just do a copy and paste here. So with this configuration, if you take a look, I've done some error here because I need to use the executions, plural here. So what I can do is with this here, make it a little bit more larger. You can define a so-called ID by its execution here, and that is automatically the one which is applied to the plugin during the execution on the command line. As you see, it is named default-CLI, and that gives you the opportunity to override this default configuration. Then I have to define the appropriate goal here for that case. In this case, I used the display dependency updates and defined all these properties here in the configuration as the XML defines here. So now I can simply call that plugin again and just omit all these parameters here. I only need the -n to prevent the recursive execution here. So I can focus that, and what you see as a result here is now that all these configuration I have defined in the POM file here will automatically be being applied to that default execution here. That means I can make it very convenient for executing such commands or goals more precisely here to make it more convenient for me to handle that and not to remember all this stuff on the command line. So now one issue comes up here, of course, is what happens if I need a different set of configurations, because I have just focused here on the dependency management, of course. What if I would like to get the information about the dependencies itself? What about these things if I would like to get the information about the dependencies of the plugins of them, something like that? So there is a more or less easy way to do that. You can enhance that and not only focus on the default command line, and this works at starting with Maven 3.3.1 of 2015, if I correctly remember from my head. You can do that. I will copy that as well because, to be honest, I can't remember all these parameters in a simple way, so I have to do that as well. I can add this supplemental execution here. And the very important thing here is that you use a different ID here. And this different ID is, as you already know, maybe if you do some executions for different plugins, you have to use a unique ID here. That is, must be unique for all your executions for that plugin. Each plugin has a separate set of executions, but that must be unique here in that case. So I have defined some of these configurations, and I have defined a little bit different and changed some of these ones and have some differences here. The first one was only to focus on the dependency management. The second, I have also focused that and limited the output here for major updates, minor updates, and things like that. So now comes the question, how can I call that from plain command line here? How can I update that and select not the default CLI configuration here? And as I mentioned before, since Maven 3.3.1, there is a simple option to do that. You can simply add an @ sign. I have to look up the exact name of these things here. This is called, I have this called BOM minor, or I can use more or less everything here, and add that with an @ sign here at the goal part here. And that simply selects that definition of the configuration here, and then instead of the default one. So you are able to define more or less any number of combinations of configurations and things like that, which you can make your life easier for simple command line options on calling. And now you see I have a different view here. If you take a look, a very detailed look, the first one, there was an update for the SJ bomb, which is fine. There is only a patch update there. But the JUnit bomb has a minor update instead. And that I have filtered out with this configuration. So I can make some similar or different configurations for filtering out particular output for configuration and executions for the different plugins. Then I can continue here with several other setups here. And one thing is coming up over the time, if you do that several times and make the usage of that, is because often, if I can do that here, for example, I just copy and paste that. So you might think, okay, that might be not the best idea. Bomb, whatever, major, for example. Then I allow, for example, the updates here. I have limited these things here, but I would like to allow major updates as well. So I can do the same thing here. I just use that ID here to call my plugin goal here. Just simply doing that. And now you see, oh, there is no dependency update because we want to get the information if there is a major update. For none of these dependencies, or more accurate, these dependency management bombs called, there is no major update at the moment. So that limits the view. One problem arises during that setup here. That means if you do that several times, and it comes a little bit cumbersome, because if you take a deeper look on these things here, you are repeating a lot of. As you already seen, I just copy and pasted that. As you already know as a Java developer, copy and pasting might be not the best choice to do writing in code. And that's the same thing here if you do that for a plugin configuration. There is a better way to solve that problem, or make it more convenient and more maintainable here in that case. What you can do is we have defined these executions, and this configuration are only applied for these executions exactly. But you can refactor that and say, okay, I would like to have these default configurations. For example, I will just take a look here. I will use all that stuff here and just move that into an upper location and say that that's my general configuration. I can do that and simply define the configuration at the definition of the plugin instead of the execution. So I can just put that information here. And now I can think about, okay, I already configured that, all this stuff here already, so I can just remove them from the separate executions here. Oops, sorry. So I can just remove that. If I've done that correctly, I can remove that completely here. So I can do that as well here, up to that point, and to that point. So I just refactored the configuration. Hopefully I didn't miss something here. And I can call these different parts here in different styles, but getting the same output here. Then the major is missing here. So you see, I have refactored the code in the right way. So I have refactored from different executions to a single global configuration. That means every plugin has two different kinds of configuration. That means you have one, a so-called global configuration. It's defined on the plugin definition level. Let us take a look. So if you start with the configuration of your plugin, then you have directly the configuration block here, and that is the so-called global configuration block. For each execution, you can define a separate configuration, for example, as I did here, for that one here, bomb minor as well. So you can do a separate configuration, which is only applied for this particular execution case. And the other configuration, as seen as well here, is applied only for that execution. There is only a small difference here. If you take a deeper look here, there's only one true-false difference. So I could continue to refactor that code as well and move this information as well to the global configuration to make it more convenient here. So we have found out that we have two different kind of configuration, a global and a specific per execution. That is one of the things you can do. There are some other interesting things which you can do with the configuration here. What is about, for example, if you have some other plugins in combination which you need, for example, and call it the goal as a supplemental configuration of another plugin. That means usually you're calling two different plugins, for example, something like that. You're calling the so-called Maven, the build helper Maven plugin, for example, and then with version set, you are calling the goal of the version's Maven plugin. So you're calling them in a chain here in that case. That means you need to configure something for the versions plugin and maybe for the build helper plugin as well. So you can do that, and because I want to have a good example here, I would like to change the version here of that my pumps here with a setup which is using in a very convenient way to make that in automatic way. If I start that, then you see something that all the pump files have been automatically updated because I defined that here next major version. There's a configuration of that plugin here. But it's very inconvenient to type that on command line. As you see, there is a backslash, there is a $sign and things like that. If you think about different operation systems like Windows or something like that, or Linux, you have to do that in a different way to prefix things like that. And here is the same way. You should do that by using this default configuration inside the pump instead of the command line. That makes it usually much more easier to handle all these cases here. What we can also have here, if I do a git status, then you see there are some files generated automatically, which I don't want to have. There are backup files generated automatically by the versions plugin, and I wanted to prevent that simply because I don't use them, because I can just use my git for that, and that is much more easier than using stuff and manually removing them. I just have prepared that, and because I did that several times here, so my history already contains the correct command here. So what I have here is now that all these changes have been made. I will make them, undo them in a few seconds, and then you see all my configurations. Now we continue that configuration by using a different setup here. I have prepared them, of course, as well, because I don't want to do that manually, because I just mistype something. So I want to prevent that. What I now can do is also to define a new name. You must be aware all the day these IDs must be unique. I use a different goal of the plugin, and I define a different configuration here because I prevent to generate these POM backups here. So I can do that as well on the command line another time here. I will do just a second. No, that's not the right one. Just a second. So we do something like that. And undo that because I don't want to change the version here. I wanted to show that only. So I have changed that. So now I can use the same command line here. And I don't need to set this backup thing here because I already done that by the configuration. So the next thing is I don't want to use that on the plain command line and handle that manually here on the command line. So I can enhance that configuration in a different way. So what I can do is to just simply get the information from the different configurations. I change that configuration in a way and add that. I have to take a look if I just copied that. Yes, so I have to remove that other way. So what you can see here is that I'm using the more or less the command line part, the -d new version equals, something like that, and already put that into my configuration here manually. So I prevent that with the need on defining that on the command line. It's much more easier for me because it's already handled there. So I can simplify my command line here in a very simple way. I can just remove all that stuff here and make my setup more easily. But I have to be careful about that I need to select the correct execution block. As I mentioned before, you can do that by adding the @ sign here And of course, you have to add the ID as defined in your configuration. I use that major here in this case. So I can do that and execute that goal here in a different way and automatically handle that from my configuration. So I could just run that, and as you see, the result is more or less the same, but I have defined much more in a much more convenient way my command line. It is much more easier to understand. It is more or less easy. And I think it's more important that your configuration is put into your version control, because it's part of your POM file here, and you can reproduce that or even use that with other projects. So I can just use that. So, sorry, this one. So if I take a look here, then you see I've changed my version number as before and things like that. They worked as before. I can do that in a different way. So we can choose another configuration here, make it much more convenient here to get the whole possibilities which can be done here. We can do that for a minor as well for so you see the different configuration. I just make the difference here in the ID. I just didn't call it major. I used just minor, which you can obviously see that its major version is parsed and the next minor version is incremented. So I increment the minor version instead of the major version here. So I can just call that, but of course I have to realize that I have to change my goal call here. And if you see that it's now changing from 700 to 7100, something like that. So using these kind of configurations makes your handling in your bombs, in your POM files and things like that much more easier to understand, much more convenient, and prevents, of course, issues on your command line because you don't need to remember all these parameters because I bet as myself as well, after 2 or 3 weeks you just cannot remember all these command line options. So that is one part here of the things here. So you can enhance that for all other different plugins, what you need, whatever you need here, and make it more convenient for you to execute the command line. But there is another story here. That means if you have a plugin or something like that configured already in your lifecycle, because you have taken a look at the moment only for plugin goals which are only configured by calling them directly from the command line instead from the lifecycle. For example, think about the Surefire plugin, for example, assembly plugin, the JavaPro plugin, or something like that. That is, of course, a little bit different story here. I have prepared some entries here. I have defined a Surefire plugin here in my POM file, which is hopefully clear that it will execute my unit tests here. That's not very fancy. I have also defined some properties here in this configuration. That means I have put them into the configuration. That means it's a global configuration. That means it will be executed and used for the execution of all goals of the Surefire plugin in such case as I defined here. What I also did is to have written a small test, or a very small kind of a test, to be honest, which just extracts the information with these f dot prefixes out of the output. So you can see that it is more convenient. Otherwise, there's a lot of bunch output, and you can't see the result here. So if I just do a package, or just a test is enough here, what you can see is if the tests are running, then you have, for each module, a test here, which prints out the information which is coming there from those system properties here. And these system properties are defined here, and so you can give them as an information in your test. That is also true for any other configuration which you are defining. I'm using that only as an example here. If you scroll up here, then you see differences here, because in the first module I have defined that as well, but I have changed the output. So the question is, how could I do that, or how can I do that in a way that I need, for example? If I in general define a configuration of a plugin into the parent, as I did here in the root POM here, that means this execution means, and definition means, that for each execution in each child or each other project which is inheriting from that POM, if I think about a parent POM or a consumer POM or something like a corporate POM or something like that, that will means that all the configuration will be inherited to these childs in there. So what I want to do is to change the information into the childs. So I have defined this here as well. Just remove that first as a first step. If you do that and just define the same part, for example, the same configuration part, the system properties here as an example, by default, any configuration which is applied to it in a child where a parent already has a configuration, it will be automatically, by default, appended to that configuration. That means in the end, you will have 3 or 4 entries in the appropriate module. If you take a detailed look here, I'm in the module 1 here, in the first module, and my general configuration contains 2 entries. First, second, and given in the other one, I have added here an f.third, something like that. So if I just run that, we take a look, and I have to scroll a bit here in that case. So if we take a look here, then you see the result in the end. That means I have defined a global configuration on the root level of my multi-module build, defined 2 entries, the last 2 lines here, f.first, f.second, and the other configuration I have defined in the child module. That means by default, all this information will be added together, and that means, in other words, the entry will be simply added to the properties configuration in that case. So, but there are sometimes situations where you don't like that or want to control that in a particular way here, which you can do. There is an option to do that, and you can do that by using the so-called combined self-override. That means for every tag, you can define how this particular part will behave here. The default is just simply append. You can do that as well here. You can get a, that's the default here. That means the default behavior. That means just appending that. The other way is to override that. That means I will completely replace the configuration which is coming from the parent with my configuration which I defined here inside my separated module here. So you can control that in a very fine-grained here. If I do that, just replace that with override. I will just rerun that example here. Sorry. So we can take a look, and the result is more or less expected, I hopefully say. Sorry. Then you see the result that there is only remaining a single entry here at the moment. That means I have completely overwritten this entry with system properties and said, just replace that with this single entry. What you can do is also change that in different ways on different levels. So you can control this configuration in a multi-module build, or even if you inherited the configuration from a corporate POM or a parent POM in any way. So you are able and capable of overwriting the configuration, appending the information, or just ignore the parent configuration. That's a different story here, and that is my last point here on my topics here, that you can control if is a configuration really used in a child. So there is a control to do that, where you can use a thing like, just a second here. So there is one entry, already did that here. Needed to have a different keyboard here usually, sorry. That means if I define in a parent this entry, it is so-called inherited to false, which is by default true, as you've seen before, that was the default behavior. And now we are saying any configuration I'm defining in that parent will not be inherited to any child. Many people misunderstand that because they are trying to define an inherited false in the childs, but that is the correct wrong way. You have to define that in the parent and prevent the automatically inheritance of the configuration of a particular plugin. There are so many ways to do that and to do the configuration and override them or give them in a different way what you can do. So if I use that here, for example, sorry, I use that, and I use the default. I just use that explicitly at the moment to show the showcase here. In the end, you might expect that all 3 entries end up, but based on this inheritance false, there is only 1 entry. Even I have defined to use the default and use the append here in this case. So we can use that and rerun that here at the way. And if you take a look, there is no test running. Ah, that's interesting, yeah. I think I have just broken something. Just a second. Or does someone have a hint where I did something wrong? It's interesting. Ah, I see. Okay, yeah, I see. Okay, now you see also an interesting thing, because I defined the inherited as false. What you see is that I'm not using the newer version of the maven-surefire-plugin in this case, because I prevented the inheritance of the complete configuration of the plugin here. That means I blocked myself in this case. But you see, you can do that and say, I want to prevent the configuration inheritance, as well as the version inheritance of the plugin. So you should be a little bit careful about your configuration, what you are using here. And that's exactly the case, so you can control very much of these things here and makes it much more easier. So I just rerun that, and what you see now is in our other module, the first one, as expected, is now running a complete different version, as well as the configuration. So that means you have the opportunity to override the configuration in different ways. You can append entries in configuration items. You can replace them completely, or you can prevent the inheritance of the plugin configuration as well as the plugin itself to a child. Maybe there are some reasons. This inheritance false is sometimes useful, but in rare cases, to be honest. That's one of the most important things to learn, that you can also control the inheritance of the plugin as well as the properties or configurations in general. So we have 3 different parts. The command line execution, we have the execution inside the lifecycle, so you can bind them or have a binding by default. With an example here as the Surefire plugin, we have resources plugin and all that other stuff as well. Or you can combine different plugins and call them in a chain, and call the goals of plugins in a chain on the command line. And this configuration gives you the opportunity to make that much more easier here, instead of typing all these parameters and then have to remember them. Because I'm seeing so many people are using that on their CI servers or GitLab or something like that, that they are typing all the time all these big parameter lines here instead of configuring them in their POM. That makes it much more easier. And of course, they're automatically put into your version control here, which is by using the command line, not that way, depending on what you're using, maybe pipelines or something like that, then it is of course as well done with the configuration in your pipelines. So from my point, that's the most important thing I have to tell you. If you have some questions, we can now start with some questions, or if you don't, that's fine as well. Thank you very much. Okay. I think I understand. The question was, can I combine the output of one plugin to put it as a pipeline as an input for the next one? Technically, I didn't do so, but what I did is using the build helper plugin, which uses some internal properties, which is storing the information, as I used as a result on the command line with these parse, next, major level, things like that. But that is on the property level. Technically, that means if you run 2 executions of plugins, that means they are started up. The first plugin is executed, the second plugin is executed. There is technically only the possibility to use such kind of properties, which must be supported by the appropriate plugin. the raw output or something like that is not possible at the moment. Maybe if you have a plugin which produces some output, put that into a property or even a file, that can be used. But combining things like that is sometimes a little bit risky because then you bind a dependency between those plugins, for example. And most of the time it's easier to make a separate plugin and handle that case in global or in general there, for example. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Some other questions? Yeah, sure. You want to use it? The rest of the sentence yeah. I would say the settings file itself is not for global configuration. It's usually for setting up your consumer repository manager or something like that. Maybe the configuration of your credentials or something like that. If you encrypt your credentials, access to your repository manager or something like that. If you have global configuration, I would recommend to use a parent POM in a way where you inherit from, something like that. It's most of the time easier. You can access the settings file even by properties. That's possible. $ curly bracket settings dot and so on. That works. But I wouldn't recommend that. But maybe we can talk later at a coffee and see more details on that. The dash uppercase N. Okay, the explanation is simply, by default, Maven uses recursive and will automatically parse and execute for all the supplemental childs in a multi-module build. And that dash uppercase N prevents that. Just a second, hold on a second. So you see where it is. I have to look it up, yeah. That's the reason for that. Because if I have 300 modules, I use the dash N to prevent recursively going into any of the submodules. That's the reason why I use that here, to make it more convenient, the output here. So far, okay, fine. Another one? If not, I'm here today and tomorrow, or just we can take a look at, drink some coffee or something else. If someone has some supplemental questions, don't hesitate to contact me or ask me, or on Twitter, whatever you like. Thank you very much.